Thank you, Avital and Dijon. I'll just do my share screen. So it's really nice to see familiar faces and new faces. So for the Israeli lot, I'm sorry for my English, for the English, and for the American lot, I'm sorry for my English as well. Okay, so hi, it's great to be here. And I'll try today, like Avital, when she introduced me, talked a bit about the fact that I'm a practitioner as well. Until half a year ago, I was a practitioner in Israel. I wrote my PhD, part of it, all my practice as a social worker in the child protection, in the Israeli child protection system. What I focused on is the relationship between poverty, child abuse and neglect, and child protection involvement, and specifically how we can take all these into account when we work with families in the welfare system and in the child protection system. And today I'm here in Royal Holloway doing my postdoc about parent participation in the context of poverty and child protection. So I will start with this. I like to start with this because I say this is, I never had the ponytail, but this is me 10 years ago. I think just going out to the field as a child protection, starting to work with families. I worked in a transitional home for children who were taken out of their homes. And for me, what my job was, and I think it reflects a lot of what the child protection system in general in Israel, a lot of similarities between Israel, the UK, and the United States in the sense of the approaches of the child protection system. And in that sense, I was a reflection of that I thought my job was to protect children mainly inside their homes, because that is the families I worked with. So child abuse and neglect for me was something that parents' actions or inactions cause children to be at risk. And that was my job, to help parents get better parents or to protect the children from what they're doing. And poverty was at the background. Of course, I'm a social worker. I knew poverty is a big problem. But in my everyday work, it was just kind of an elephant. And when I started writing my thesis with Professor Michal Krumer-Nevo that focuses in poverty, I started seeing this elephant. And once you see him, it's really hard to stop noticing him. And this is part of why my PhD started. And this is what I'm going to talk today about. First, what does this elephant look like in child protection? And how can we deal with it? How can we try to work with it? So what I'll do, I will start with I'll present the new evidence we have about child abuse and neglect and poverty. There's quite a lot of research going on from all over the world. Then I'll try to talk about why it's such an elusive relationship and why it's such an elephant a lot of times when we work with families. Then I'll try to suggest a paradigm, a framework, so we can take these understandings about the relationships and see how we can work with it in our everyday practice. So I will start first of all by saying it's clear that poverty has a very bad influence and is a risk for children outcomes in achievements in health and criminal justice involvement, in their well-being. A lot of research shows that their outcomes are much less children who grew up in poverty. So we know that about poverty and children's development and children's outcomes when they're adults. The next thing that we know is that there is a strong association between families' socioeconomic circumstances and the chances that their children experience child abuse and neglect. And I told Avita I really like this new feature, so you'll see it quite a lot today. So we know in the UK, there's just recently finished a very big research about child protection and poverty and deprivation. And they found, Bywaters and his colleague, that the child in the most deprived neighborhood in the UK is 10 times more likely to get involved in the care system than a child in the most affluent locality. In the US, in the NIS4 2010, they found that economically insecure children are 3 times as likely to be abused and about 7 times as likely to be neglected than economically secure children. We'll talk a bit later, because what the UK study helps us to understand that there's a social gradient. It's not like all the children in poverty are in one stance and all the children not in poverty are in different chances. We can see that as long as the deprivation grows, so does the chances to be part of the system and and be abused and neglected. The next thing the evidence shows us that it goes around all kinds of countries, mainly developed countries, types of abuse, definitions, measures, research approaches. It's something that was found in a multitude of researches. And lately, there was Konrad Hebner and Briam published a synthesis of evidence from 26 longitudinal studies in the mostly UK, but also Japan, mostly USA, but also UK and Japan, on the temporal relation between economic insecurity and child maltreatment. And they found it across all these settings and across all kinds of measures that income loss, cumulative material hardship, and housing hardship are the most reliable predictors of child maltreatment. So we see all kinds of elements that are related to poverty that come into play in making the chances of child abuse and neglect grow. Another really interesting thing is that we're starting to check the connection between income changes and how it impacts the rates of child abuse and neglect. And we see that rising the income of families is a statistically significant impact on the rates of poverty. These are two studies from the US. One, Risen and Bullinger found that $1 increase in the minimum wage implies a statistically significant 9.6% decline in neglect and reports. So it's really, we can see a real shift, and they did it across a lot of states, almost all the states in the United States. And this decline is concentrated among young children and school-age children. We can think there are all kinds of explanations why it is, but a lot of it is that in these ages, small changes in income make a big change in what you can provide in very basic needs. Another finding is that the increase in income from outside, like earned income tax credit, was associated with reduction in behaviorally approximated child neglect and CPS involvement. Also, they checked families that got earned income tax credit and saw that the chances of finding neglect and child protection involvement drop when there's more income. I knew this will happen sometime. Yeah. So going on with the research, the next thing, these are a bit like a population-based research, and now I'm going to talk a bit about research that talks about the micro-interactions and how poverty comes into play in these arenas. And we can see that a lot of qualitative research that check the interactions between social workers, families, and the child protection system found that families experience the system as intimidating, confusing, shaming, and even humiliating when, this is a self-citation of myself, in my research that was published in the Journal of Society of Social Work and Research, I found that parents described how their parental behaviors that were deeply embedded in the struggle against poverty, and that's how they understood what they did for their children, were interpreted by social workers as irresponsible parenting that should be condemned. So a lot of time, poverty becomes something that parents are blamed for or understood as something that they did wrong. The next thing is on the side of social workers, that a lot of studies found that poverty is not seen as the core business of child protection. Even it's not seen as a business of like the elephant I showed earlier. And this is a really something new that Yona Nadan published just earlier this month, I think, about the fact that how social workers respond when families ask for financial help. So they say the social workers in the current study tend to refer people living in poverty to clinical intervention, dealing with psychological problems, which are not in keeping with the parents' perceptions of their needs. In many cases, that the parents apply for assistance because of their economic difficulties, they accept the responses to focus on concrete material assistance. So it's also a question of what we as social workers see as the range of things we need and what's our responsibility towards poverty. And I'll present an alternative option to how we see poverty in child protection. And regarding the way if poverty influences decision-making, there are quite mixed findings, but this is an Israeli study because some study didn't find bias, that the social workers don't make different decisions between families in poverty and families not in poverty. But the Notion Bayer-Topilsky in Israel found that when they gave vignettes to social workers describing risk situation, they found that the low socioeconomical status children were more than 6 times likely to be recommended for out-of-home placement than moderate-high socioeconomic status children. I'll translate it in normal language. If the same assessment was made about what the risk is, the subjective risk assessment, still children in poverty were 6 times likely more to be recommended for out-of-home placement. So we understand that there is also a way of how social workers interpret parenting in poverty that also influences the relationship between poverty and child abuse and neglect. So this is more, of course, there's a multitude of studies, but these are like the main points I think that are important to establish the fact that we know there's a relationship. We know that it comes into, that it happens in the everyday lives of families. It's not only something that we know, and we're starting to know what happens in these micro interactions. But still, it's really hard, like the elephant I showed earlier. And there's a difficulty of understanding it and looking it in how it comes into play in practice. And in this sense, it's an elusive relationship that requires us to think why it is elusive and what we can do to make it clearer. The first reason why it's so elusive, I think, is there's the difficulty of establishing a causal relationship. We can't say, and we don't want to say, that poverty leads immediately to abuse and neglect. Of course not. But we do need to understand the mechanisms to which poverty does lead a lot of families and children to suffer from abuse and neglect or to be involved in the system. And in this sense, there's a question, how do we explain these interactions and these pathways? And there are two main explanations in the literature that at the moment are quite split between needs and risk explanations and bias explanation. And it's a debate, controversial in many ways in the literature. So the need and risk explanation say some quite simple. It's simple. That needs, people in poverty, children in poverty, are just in situations that are much more riskier from all kinds of reasons. We know there's also a correlation with mental health and poverty. We know that poverty is influenced by where children live and how the neighborhood looks like. And living in poverty makes risk in a lot of ways. And they say, okay, there's just much more risk, and that's why much more children are suffering from abuse and neglect. On the other side, the bias debate says it's not that there's actual risk for these children more, but there's a systemic and a personal bias against these families. Systematically speaking, it's because these families are much more exposed to the welfare system. They're much more seen. And in the individual level, like the research I showed earlier, it's claimed that social workers are biased in their assessments. So currently, there's quite of a split between these two explanations. The problem with this split is at the end of the day, it leaves social workers in the front line, or child protection professionals, not only social workers, with individualized notions, because it's much more easier to try and take one risk at a time and look at it not in a systematic way, but really in an individual way. And at the end of the day, that's what leads the policy and practice. It's more targeted to needs and risk explanation. And what happens is that poverty becomes too big to tackle and too familiar to notice. And that's how it goes to the background in an article written here in the UK. Morris and her colleagues said it's the wallpaper of practice becomes. And another reason that maybe I had to put it up is the thing that we don't want to avoid labeling families. Okay, we don't want to do this link automatic, right? We want to see the complexity and not to say that poverty immediately means child abuse and neglect. Of course not, but we do need, it's a bit like racism. We need to be aware and not say it's all the same. Leroy Pelton, an American scholar, called it the myth of classlessness, like saying, oh, it happens everywhere. We know that it happens everywhere, but we do need to see the links and we can't ignore them. And I put the elephant again because all these things lead to the situation that we talked about. And what I would like to talk today and the core of my presentation is about how we try to challenge what I call the risk-focused paradigm that is dominant, as I talked about it a bit till now, I think, in all kinds of ways, and to offer a poverty-aware paradigm for child protection. I'll talk about it a bit, but mainly I would like us to ask ourselves 3 questions, and I think these questions are very helpful in practice. We can ask ourselves, when we look at a situation, when we treat a family, we need to ask ourselves, how do we perceive the risk to the children? How do we assess risk? What knowledge do we use to assess risk? And what's our job at the end of the day, ethically and practically? So it's quite a lot. I'm quite ambitious. We'll see where I get, but I hope to give you some kind of picture of how we can imagine social workers taking into account poverty when they work with families. So just short, maybe not, it's a slide, but it can be a whole course about the poverty-aware paradigm, that a lot of my work is based on it, and it was developed by Michal Kurmer-Nevo in Israel. She was my PhD supervisor, and I said I'll do some promotion for a new book, Radical Hope, highly recommended. And it's important because we need to understand, first of all, when I say poverty, what exactly do I mean? What do I talk about when I try to talk about poverty? And the first thing that the poverty-aware paradigm suggests, and then we'll see how it connects to child protection, is that poverty is multidimensional. It's not only a lack of material capital, like we are a lot of time used to look at it, but it's a lack of all kinds of capitals. It's a lack of social capital, meaning what opportunities do children have and families, what's the social opportunities and what the social opportunities, and a lack of symbolic capital in the relational sphere. It's how people in poverty are treated in society. What's poverty got to do when a social worker and a parent in poverty meets? And these are symbolic elements of poverty, and that it's a violation of human rights. It's not only a lack of a structural problem, but it's an actual violation of everyday human rights, and not only human rights like the right to prosper, but also the right for dignity and the right for respect. And in that sense, we want to look at people living in poverty, not like we're used to as passive a lot of time. That's how they're perceived with notions of the culture of poverty. Instead, we want to look where people in poverty resist their poverty. And research shows, empirical research, qualitative research shows us that people in poverty are in a constant struggle to fight their poverty. They're not passive at all. The next thing is that knowledge is something situated, and we'll talk about it when I talk about assessments. It's a major part of it. But knowledge is also what we call positioned. The knowledge of people in poverty. Okay. The knowledge of people in poverty have about their life and about poverty, about parenting in poverty, is very different from the knowledge I have, for example, as a white, middle-class man. And in this sense, we talk about we need to create relationship in order to create new knowledge within these relationships. And at the end, what's our job? And I'll talk about everything. These is like the fundamentals for what I'm going to talk about, connect to child protection, but that we need to have an ethical standpoint of solidarity, how we can stand by people in poverty, not change them or not change their functioning, but stand by them because we understand their struggle. So this is the foundations of the idea what poverty is and what social work with poverty is. But it's quite difficult when I, as a social worker, try to translate these ideas into child protection and into the setting where suddenly risk is in a risk-averse setting, and risk is very dominant in our work because we want to protect children and we need to protect children. It becomes very hard to hold this complexity. And in this sense, what I try to do, and this is a paper that I published with Anna Gupta, is to try to offer a poverty-aware paradigm for child protection that will challenge the risk-focused paradigm. And I will take each one of these questions and I'll try to show them against the risk-focused paradigm, the notions of the mainstream risk-focused paradigm in the United States, in the UK, and Israel. The first thing about that risk is a result of inadequate and pathological parenting. I think we talked about it, and maybe all of us practitioners know when I started working as a social worker, I always thought that what children need protection from are, especially when there's trauma, is immediately their parents. But we need to look how we can expand that. And the theoretical basis that we use a lot of time, that's the body of knowledge we have, is mainly psychological. I'm not saying, of course, these are very important and I use these bodies of knowledge, but in the current system, these are like at the center. It's attachment theory, it's trauma-informed approaches. It's very approaches that look on the individual way of parenting and how we can help parents better be parents. And what we do in the poverty-aware paradigm, we try to expand that and to start looking at risk as a systemic causation embedded in structural inequality. We want to look at this situation where much more children from poverty are experiencing abuse and neglect, or child protection involvement, and to start to look at it in structural ways and to start to understand why this is happening, not only at the individual level of a family, but in a wider level. And in this sense, we need to take a wider view of risks to children's well-being, social harms and policies, a bit like I showed you in the income, when changes in the minimum wage, what happens. And in that way, the poverty-aware paradigm for child protection, what in the research I talked to earlier, I suggest the poverty child protection matrix. That since, again, my feature, that it tries to show the complexity and the multidimensionality. I won't go through everything, and if later, if you want, I told Avital I can send these materials. But what I want you to see is that what I found from interviews with families and with social workers, that it's really like, intertwined. It's like, I don't know how you say blanket, and that goes like this when we knit. So you have the child, you have the parent and the parent-child relationship, and they're affected by each one of these dimensions. And in that sense, it's also material, and it's lack of basic needs and the early exposure, everything I said. It's also social, what services, what health services the children said, where do the parents work? Okay, all these things are so intertwined into how the parenting of these people occurs, and we need to take them into hand. And this is like what I want to suggest here. It's like a map that we can try to look into assessments. And in the symbolic relational, like I said, parents felt being blamed and shamed, rejected, also because of the poverty. And in that sense, what I want to suggest is that we need to look at all these things in order to understand. I always think about it. I think in the COVID, we all found it much more, suddenly being at home all day with your children, for me, how much more stressful it is than having a lot of other options for your children. Or what does it mean for children when they go out from their house to a different neighborhood, or what it's like, even now in England, I must say, when I started living here, we started going to school in Israel, I go by car. And now we started going by bus. And it's the first time in my life I understand how hard it is to be dependent on the state, because I can be late to school every morning because I thought the UK will have good, I hope we don't have British people that will be insulted, but I thought they'll have a good infrastructure for buses, but it's late all the time. And suddenly I feel this stress every morning. And if I was already a parent, I have symbolic capital in all kinds of ways. But what does it mean? All these things, what does it mean at the end of the day when a child doesn't come to school a lot, and how social workers will look at it and how it's part of our assessment? So we need to take all these into account when we talk about how do we perceive risk. And the last thing we need to think about is an emphasis on relational and emotional aspects of parenting in poverty. I won't go to it in too much in depth because of time, but there is an emphasis on looking how it comes into life when we meet people, how parents experience, professionals, the concept of othering, the us and them. A lot of times the parents of the welfare parents aren't like, all kinds of making all the welfare parents. So how parenting is interpreted, I will say, it's an example, take it, I hope I'm not too talking about myself, but when I get really angry, let's say in the supermarket on my child, and I will respond very aggressively, let's say, okay, not too much, yes, a lot of child protection workers here, but it can be experienced in one way, but with my symbolic capital, it is experienced in other. And I think social workers, we need to start looking at these things and reflect on them in our everyday practice, how these symbolic interactions also play a part in how we assess risk. The next question I would like us to ask is, what knowledge do we need in order to assess risk? You know, currently there is a lot of occupation with risk factors and measurements and using frameworks and tools. And today we're starting to talk about actual assessment tools. And of course, as a social worker, these are really important and we need to promote standardized thinking as well. But it also holds a question of what knowledge do we know and how careful we need to know, especially if we remember what I talked earlier about what kind of knowledge counts, and that people in poverty knowledge a lot of times is devaluated. And in that sense, what I want to suggest is that we need to involve questioning the ways in which knowledge about risk is produced and determine the sources that shape it. But I always say the example, you know, when you treat a family, it's not really a poverty-related example, but I think it's a really important example of knowledge and construction. I worked with a family that it was in a process of reunification. And as part of the reunification, the child went to home visits with his mother. He didn't grow up with her from the age of 3 weeks. He was taken from the hospital and he was 4.5 already when I worked with him on the reunification. And every time after we had, he went for a home visit, when he came back to the foster family, he did his needs at bed. I think that's the most normal way to say it. And every time there was a big debate between the foster family. If we had that time, I would have asked you what you think the reaction was. But the foster family explained it as a problem because he sees her and she makes him very upset and it's hard for him to meet her. And the mother, the birth mother, used to say that it's because it's hard for him. He sees her and then to say goodbye, and it's very hard. And in that sense, I want us to ask ourselves, first of all, this is about how knowledge is produced. And I know this elephant is known. I mean, each one of these people see it in a different way, and we can all interpret reality in all kinds of ways. But I want to add to this, who has the power to go to court and say what part of the elephant it is. And I think this is something we need to take into account into assessments and to see how we incorporate families' situation and interpretations to the situation. And the other thing that a lot of time, it's a bit what I said earlier about the inclusion of structural and social context, is the fact that a lot of time we dismiss these things, and how we can do a movement from the micro to the micro, from the micro to the micro when we assess risk. Just another example, I'm looking at the time, but a family I worked with, and the child, we got a report that the child is waiting, it's a 5.5-year-old child waiting alone at 7 in the morning for the bus, for the school bus to take him. And there was a lot of panic. I mean, it is a very bad situation, but the mother was really, I mean, the social worker was really very, very disturbed from the fact that the mother, what the social worker felt that she's giving excuses. And when I met the mother and I worked with her for a year, and it took time until I understood exactly what happened. But I'll make this long story short, we found out that she needs to go to work at a certain hour. But she did try to put him, and if she doesn't go to work, you know, it's the labor market she works in, she's a contract worker, so she'll be fired. So in the next phase, she tried to put her with their neighbor, but the neighbor, she didn't rely on her as well. So all these things at the end, when we got to know each other and there was a safe relationship, we could give an explanation and find another solution, but it had to come from looking at the structure and maybe saying the structure is irresponsible, not this mother. And if we take care of the macro, and not in this case all the macro, but take care of how we can come to school or how she can get to work, we can do something different in our assessment. And this means we need to create relationships. And I think this is, I mean, also common knowledge with attachment theory and all the trauma informed that we need relationships, but we also need to see power as part of the relationship and to take into account that parents feel our power as child protection professionals, and a lot of time feel that their knowledge is excluded, and we need to highlight how we can do it differently. The next thing is, what's our job? I mean, it's a question I think we don't ask ourselves enough. I don't, and I try to do it when I supervise and when I work with families, and to ask ourselves, how do I see what I do? What's my ethical stance? And really in the risk-focused paradigm, current risk-focused paradigm, the main narrative This is Lone and his colleagues' notion of ethical child rescue narrative that leads a lot of the work, and the best interest of the child. Of course, I'm part of it, of this ethical stance, but we need to ask ourselves, what does it mean, the best interest of the child, I think? And in this sense, what poverty-aware paradigm for child protection try to say that children's rights are always interwoven and inseparable from those of their parents, families, and communities. And that we need to see that also in this context, we don't do a split between the parents and the child, and how we can look all the time, even when a parent can't take care of his child, how we can look at the parent, and always say, even in adoption, we need to look at the internalized relationship with the parents. And in that sense, I would like to suggest that we start looking at the best interest of the relationships and not only of the child, because the child is the relationship with his parents. And in that sense, if we want to stand by the relationship, a lot of time it's to stand by the struggle against poverty as well. Okay, sometimes relationship, if we need the conditions to be good relationship, and this takes us back to an ethics of solidarity. How do we make them we with us and stand by parents and families and children in the struggle, because we know poverty is a struggle. Poverty in parenting in the context of poverty is also a struggle, and we need to see how we stand by parents, not only transform their parenting. A lot of times that's what happened to me in practice, and it's easy to go there a lot of times, because like we say, poverty is too big to tackle. It's much more easier to help. It's not easier, yeah. It can be really, really hard to help change patterns, but it is much more in the scope of what we can do. And in that sense, it's how we can try to move from the structural to the individual all the time, and stand by parents and recognize the struggle and give it recognition. I think this is also, even if a parent can't care for his child, or a child is at risk, we need to see it in this context. Avital, just I'll ask, we said until 45, right?
Yeah, 45 or 50.
Okay, no, I'm fine, actually. So now, really the question is, okay, I hope I made clear what's the paradigm and what's the framework, but still at the end of the day, we meet families and children in very bad situations. And this is something the poverty-aware paradigm can help us to understand, that the material and the emotional are intertwined, and that poverty is also an issue of power relations, like I said. And in this sense, we want practice with these families to be on two legs. Maybe we can say one leg is the relationship-based practice, and I think that that's the more intuitive way to work in the context, because we create relationships. We understand that a lot of time pathology is within relationship, trauma is within relationship, and we need to come into these relationships and create relationship by ourselves with the families, and that's where healing can hopefully happen. But we also, because we understand it as a violation of human rights, we need to stand by the families and help them receive the rights, all the dimension of rights, the rights for dignity, the right for social opportunities and having good schools and having good health system, and the right for not having material deprivation. In my research, I didn't talk about it too much. I found children, and before we got on this call, Avital told me that in Oklahoma, 19.6% of the children live in poverty. That's 1 out of 5. In Israel, it's 1 out of 3. These numbers are really unacceptable, and we need to think about it all the time when we work, and we need to take it into account. And this is like a really long list. I won't go, one by one on them. I mean, I won't go into each one of them, but I think it's really important, first of all, to make poverty central to assessments and work with families. Just like we're used to look and assess safety, we're used to look and assess relationships, we need to look and assess also how poverty influences, because it's such a big part of these families' life. The next thing is that we need to think also, and this is public health approaches that are very developing rapidly into child protection in the last 10 years. And this we need to ask ourselves, how can we not work only with the families at the end of the line that are already, we think that there is risk or something is happening there, And now we start thinking in primary and secondary responses, universal responses to poverty, and community-based responses. And there's, I think it's in Oklahoma, actually, the Strength in Community. I know it's in Colorado, maybe. Strength in Community, the Gary Melton program, and all kinds of programs that try to look at it in a wider sense, not only how we work with the individual family, because we understand that poverty is also a social issue. So we need to inform our assessments by relationship-based knowledge, financial and practical support. If you go back to the quote I brought from Jonas and Nadan's research, and today we're starting to see a lot of all the unification programs and the intensive intervention programs are starting to understand that families at the end of the continuum must have also financial and practical support. This is something that happens in Israel as well. I didn't talk about, in Israel, this is very developed and is already implemented in some programs, this poverty aware paradigm. Really, I was so inside the presentation to say that. But it's important to say that we are starting to have experience with trying to implement this. And we know that provision of financial and practical support is a lot of time what the families need. And we need to give social workers, part of the reason that social workers don't want to deal with poverty is because they don't have the resources. And this is also part of the change we need to do. I talked about relationship-based practice, active rights-based advocacy. I can say from my own, and it's not something we do a lot, you know, as a social work practitioner in a community center that works therapeutically with parents, it's not something naturally for me, but I started trying to go with parents out of the therapy room, and if they needed help in social insurance, or if they're very occupied with something, I started seeing the links, and sometimes what it can do to a relationship, going with the parent and being an advocate for him, it can really help not only the relationship, but really actually directly the parenting a lot of times. So we need to start thinking in wider ways of what does it mean to help parenting. Of course, I think it's in every field, but in this sense, because we want to look at social position, we must have reflective practice and to look how our social positioning influences the way we meet families, we assess families. We need to look at all these things. And I think something that part of what I'm doing here today in the UK now is to start to look with families, what does poverty-proof policy looks like? How can we adjust the systems? And we need to co-produce knowledge with families about it. And this is a bit of what I'm doing now. We're trying to map the services for parents because this is what parents say they need the most. So we need to start working with parents, not only about the parenting, but parents that were in the system and are in a situation to do it. We need to start asking them how they think. And in New York, there's a lot of parent advocacy going on as well. And I think this is another direction for more secondary responses, co-producing knowledge and trying to work with parents to change policy. The last thing, and a lot of times something that social workers feel is out of their scope, is policy practice. And when I say policy practice, I mean, it's not only like going to the parliament, even though in Israel we did some things like that as well, but it's also in the community a lot of times. It's trying to help families change things in the micro life that a lot of times come into play because of procedures, because of policies. And we need to see, as social workers, how we don't stay only in the individual level and try to do a bit more in these senses as well. I just give a small example from my practice, is that a woman I worked with and her child went to, in Israel, if a parent doesn't pay his debts to the nursery, the child can be excluded from the nursery. And this is a parent I worked with in a dyadic, trauma-informed CPP model. But in that crisis moment, it felt that this is the only thing that makes the parenting and very, very hard because the child was excluded. And after we finished taking care of it in the community level and getting help for her to get him back into the nursery, part of the work we did was going to the parliament and trying to work on changing this situation. And it didn't get too far. I mean, there was a letter from the ministry saying that it shouldn't happen, but it's not a law or something yet. But for this mother, it was also so significant. And it means we can go on and look at it in wider concepts and not only in the individual practice. And these are the references And
Yuval, thank you
that's me.
so much. That's a lot to take in, I'm sure, and digest and process. And I'm so glad we do have, yes, Joni, I agree. We do have 15 minutes for Q&A, any questions or comments, reflections. It's a good opportunity. I know there is a lot of difference between the UK context, the US context, and the Israeli context, but there's also some similarities. So it's a good opportunity while we have Yuval here on this call to use his expertise. So any questions, you're welcome to put it in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and want to unmute yourself and ask or say something, we'll be very happy to hear your thoughts. Also, I put in the chat the link to Michal Komer-Nevo's book in English. I do not profit off of this. Yuval doesn't profit off of this, and neither does Haruv, but a very good book. And some of the ideas that Yuval talked about today are in there. If you're interested in finding out more, then that's a good resource. Okay, let's see if we have any. I see that there's a lot of, let's see some of what's going on in the chat. A lot, wow, that's a lot to observe. Great information, thank you. Great, important information. I think people are taking this in.
Yeah, I was so occupied with the time, so I run, so we have time to talk.
Right.
Can I say something?
Sure. Go ahead, Sophia.
Okay. I wish I could talk in Hebrew. It would be much easier.
You can talk in Hebrew and I'll translate you if you want. But I think you sound like you're doing a good job in English too.
I just want to say I'm pretty new in social work. I work less than a year. And I really, during my school, I came to know Komer-Nevo, and I really connect to that. And it's something that really occupies me as a משפחות.
Family social worker.
It's the same in all languages. I don't know whether the jobs are different or the same. How do I actually do it in practice? Because it's like Yuval said, you don't have the resources and you see one case at a time, and you don't really get to the relationship that you wanna, so you can build something else. And it really, really occupies me as a pretty much new social worker. How can I do better? How can I help the families in my care? I really enjoyed your lecture, and I also asked whether I can pass it down in my workplace. And I think I'm gonna buy the book.
So we did something today. I'm not sure if the question is how to do it or you're trying to reflect on how hard it is. I think the first phase is how we frame it.
It's more a reflection, and I'm not expecting for a video.
Because I don't have it in my pocket, so yeah.
But I think, Sophia, I wanna, at least from my end, I can say that the question is important, the reflection is important, the wanting to do this type of work and wanting to look at what we do more critically and try to think about how to create those relationships. I think that's a great start, and she should go ahead, and there's a lot of resources that we can recommend and all of that, but it's a process, I think. I've been in this job as a social worker, I mean, for over 16 years, and I still feel like it's a process.
I'm interested to ask the American guests. I mean, if it resonates, if you find it, I mean, because you know, it's how much context related is it, or do you find it relevant? So, if someone wants. It's the silence of the Zoom.
Yuval?
Yes. Okay.
Hi. I'm Yara. I don't think my camera was off. Thank you. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask one question. I'm not a social worker, but I work with some. And I recently heard about a theory. I think it's called social work wears poverty or something like that in Israel. עבודה סוציאלית מודעת עוני. So does it familiar? Do you refer to it in your work?
Yeah, I think that's the core of my I mean, that's what I rely on. That's poverty-aware social work. What I presented is taking it into the framework of child protection, and a lot of what we are doing in Israel was trying to take this and adapt it into the child protection system. So that's the body of research I'm leaning on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yara. We also have a comment in the chat from a participant that works with families in the US and wanted this info to be more aware and sensitive to these issues, and says that this has been an amazing webinar on this. Thank you, Joni.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Savannah Simmons, and I'm an LCSW, and I don't really work in child protective services, but I've definitely done family therapy and individual therapy. And I did feel that it was relevant, even, you know, because of course in family therapy, you're trying to help them with their relationship and patterns and whatnot. And it was so hard at times just with the different barriers that they had, especially with where I'm in, I guess everybody here is in Oklahoma. I'm not sure, maybe not, but even with students or clients who had parents who were undocumented and all that the different factors that would bring in and the limited resources that they had was really difficult dynamic as well. And it would impede being able to try to improve the family dynamic a lot of times because, you know, the mom wouldn't be home. She would be working two, 3 jobs, and the kids would be acting as parents. And, you know, they would try for different services and would be denied for different reasons. So anyways, I found it was really, really helpful and insightful, and just kind of reminding that just to treat people with dignity and to remember that they have good intentions, that they also want good things for their children. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks. And I think it's a really important, the thing is sometimes in practice, it's hard for us to see it, and it translates, let's say the parenting child. So it's hard for us to see the context, and we see the problems it makes for children because we don't want children to take parental stances. And in that sense, I think it's really tricky how to help the children not be parents, help the parents be parents, but see how hard it is. So thanks.
There are a few more comments in the chat that I'd like to read out. Excellent and important presentation. Thank you. Your information is a strong statement on our job as social workers to be advocates, to influence public policy. Very, very, very much true. Another participant, I think from England, who has shared previously. Thank you very much. You have solidified practice methods here in the UK and US for me. Another comment is, I think one of the most important mentions for me was not to view poverty as simply background or wallpaper, quote unquote, but to keep it in the forefront of what has created the whole picture for the family needing help.
Yeah, I read an article, they talked about social workers, even if they are where they park it in the signs of safety. It was a research about how signs of poverty inside of safety comes into play. And they say that it's a complicating factor, but they park it in the 3 houses, and it's really how you put it in the front and work about it. I think that's one of the challenges.
Definitely.
Shalom.
Shalom. Who's talking?
אני יכול לשאול ולתרגם, יש לי בעיה קצת עם האנגלית.
בטח, אין בעיה.
סחטתי את המוח. קודם כל, אני נג'אר חליל מהצפון, מכפר קטן, פסוטה, עובד במרכז הרפואי לגליל. אני עובד במיון ילדים, אנחנו נפגשים המון עם ילדים, ואני מרגיש מין עיוורון כזה, כי לא מצליחים, אין לנו את הכלים איך להתמודד, אנחנו כאנשי צוות, עם הדברים האלה. אני נחשפתי לאחרונה דרך מכון חרוב לדברים האלה, ונורא אתה מרגיש מין החמצה אחרי המון שנים במקצוע, ואין לנו את הכלים האלה, פשוט לא נכנס לתוך ההכנה המקצועית לאנשי מקצוע שנחשפים לילדים ומשפחות כאלה, איך אתה מתמודד קודם כל, ואיך אתה מתמודד עם משפחות כאלה ועם ילדים כאלה. איך אנחנו תוקפים את הסיפור הזה?
אתה מתכוון ספציפית לנושא של התעללות והזנחה, או לעוני, או לגם וגם?
גם וגם, הרי אצלנו בחברה מולטיקלצ'ר רב תרבותית, נורא, אין לך, בסדר, יכול להיות שאני כן קצת מכיר, ועדיין אין לי את הכל, גם מהחברה שאני חי בה, וגם מהחברות האחרות, אני מרגיש מן החמצה, אם יש איזושהי תוכנית שאפשר כן לתת לנו כלים ולהיות יותר מעורבים וגם לזהות, הרי ברגע שאתה מזהה את הבעיה, אתה יותר קל לך לתקוף אותה. אם אפשר גם לתרגם את השאלות וגם לענות, תודה.
בטח, אני אענה מהצד שלי, ואז ניתן כמובן גם יובל יענה,
וזאת תהיה שאלה. No, it's a Haruv question, important.
כן, so, השם הפרטי שלך הוא חליל?
כן.
Okay. Halil works at a hospital setting in the north of Israel, in a multicultural setting with both obviously Arab clients and Jewish clients, and feels some frustration as to only recently learning more about child abuse and neglect, as well as poverty, as well as the intersection between the two, and feels like he has not gotten enough knowledge and skills as to what to do with this difficult situation and difficult intersection between these social problems. So Khalil, first of all, I want to thank you for your vulnerability and honesty in sharing that. I think that it's a big thing for a professional to say, hey, I don't think that I have enough tools, knowledge, interventions, whatever, to, resources to tackle and to handle this problem. So I appreciate it. I can tell you that I'd be happy to be in touch after the talk is over and to try to connect you to Haruv Israel. They'd be very happy to offer additional training to your staff at Nahariya, both social workers and medical staff, to think about training them to be better equipped. That's what we do, and I'll be happy to make that connection.
Thank you.
I'll just say one thing that Khalil reminded me, that I didn't talk about race and intersectionality almost. And in the States, I mean, it's a whole body of research and there's intersections really between poverty, race, and child abuse and neglect. It's also something that we need to take into account. And I think starting to look at it in a multidimensional framework, and maybe in the hospital, you see all this multidimensionality coming in with all these contexts. I think this is one of our missions in Haruv and generally.
Thank you, Yuval. So final comment to wrap this session up. First of all, Yuval, a lot of thanks. This has been very important, I feel, to start the conversation about these topics.